I wanted to talk about debt today because debt is something that, very similar to taxes, is kind of just labeled with a blanket bad, and then people don't really think about it any further than that. But really, it's to a lot of people's detriment because debt, although being very dangerous in many aspects and contributing to a lot of huge societal problems, is also one of the most fundamental tools of economics that can really explain a lot of the phenomena that you see occurring throughout your day-to-day life. Debt is somewhat the other side of income, where you could have $100. You could also have debt for $100, meaning that you owe $100. So it allows your income or your accounts to be negative effectively. But it's a promise of payment in the future. So although debt is the other side of cash in hand effectively, it's slightly more complicated because unlike cash, which theoretically, even if it's in a bank account or in your hand or you give it to a friend or something like that, it's always worth exactly what it is. Whereas debt is more tricky than that because not all debt is created equal. Some debt is much more dangerous than others. And that's one thing that it just seems to fly right over people's heads. And generally, that's one of the things that makes the United States, the debt that the United States carries, it's so misconstrued because it's like, yes, it is trillions of dollars of debt, and that is an insane amount of money, and yet it's not like credit card debt that's like at 23% or something asinine. Those trillions of dollars are almost entirely issued in the form of treasury bonds or government bonds. It's a bond of some sort. And it's issued at just barely above the inflation rate. So if inflation is targeted at 2%, these bonds are going to be at like 2.1% return over each year. And it's like, okay, so this debt is practically free when you account for inflation. And that's because the United States has such an incredible borrowing history. They've always paid their debts and their reserve currency, which means that even though the United States as a whole is shouldering trillions of dollars of debt, it would almost be disadvantageous to pay that debt off because we effectively have an infinite credit line that we can just, buy stuff and just pile it into the debt. And then if we ever really needed to deal with that debt, we could just hike up inflation over 2% and start eating away at that debt because inflation works both ways. Not only will inflation reduce the value of your buying power of any money in your accounts, but if you have any long-standing debt, inflation will also degrade that debt. So that's why it's widely regarded that there is actually such a thing as good debt, because some debt, like in the form of investments, leveraged investments that aren't over-leveraged, like real estate, generally it's well understood that if you have a leveraged loan on a house that you're using either to create income or that is just your primary residence, you can leverage your income to effectively take on that debt. And then over the course of that 30-year mortgage, you have 30 years of interest effectively eating away at the amount of money that you owed. So it's almost more advantageous to have that debt than to not. But that also doesn't take into consideration the fact that we are loading up our students with some of the worst debt you can have. I guess it's reasonable interest rate. It's probably around 8% or something like that, but it's relatively high interest rate debt that's unforgivable, and that not only that, it's on I don't know if it's technically a speculative commodity, but it's on a very intangible commodity that is a degree. Because one, you take student loan debt before you even start school. It's not like you take out the debt, you pay the money, and then you get the degree. There's a lot of people who take out tons and tons and tons of loans, and then they never actually finish the degree. And theoretically, if you get 75% of the way through a degree, you have 75% of the knowledge. So you're 75% as employable, except that's not how that works at all, because everyone knows that the reason you go to college is to get that degree, that certification, so that, your employer can be like, oh, you went to college, check. And, they can filter their applications, by who has a degree. And so that we don't have to look through every Joe Schmo, because our current credentialing system is horribly broken, and it's not dependent on people's actual abilities. It's just dependent on whether or not they actually grunted through all the coursework and got the gold star, which is to our detriment, but it is how it is currently. Like, that is the system that we find ourselves in. And that debt is horribly corrosive to society, because it's debt on who should be the most dynamic people, the people you want to have making changes and, pushing society forward, the people who are the young, driven individuals, and yet you're saddling them with a massive obligation that can't even be forgiven. Like, not even the United States debt is, like, the United States could default on its debt if it wanted. It will never do that, hopefully, but college students don't even have that luxury, and there's not even there's no checks or anything to see if you'll even have the ability to pay back your loans given your degree type, like a sociology degree or whatever. Even if you get that degree, which you might not, because your funding might dry up halfway through, but even if you get that degree, there's no guarantee that the job that you'll get with that degree is going to be a high-earning job. And so it's just very short-sighted and corrosive to society, I believe. But that being said, not all debt is equal. That debt is bad because it's not really tied to something that is tangible, as well as it's weighing down effectively the people who you would want to be more dynamic. But having things in the form of leveraged assets and things like that, that debt is almost considered more safe than just keeping cash on hand, because inflation will always eat away at your cash. But if you're in leveraged assets, then you can just have that work the other way around. And so, I don't know, debt is, like I said, debt is like taxes. It's a one syllable word. Taxes is two, but it's a one syllable word that everyone just assumes is bad. So because they assume it's bad, they don't actually learn enough about it to prevent the shortcomings that, might be caused by ignorance about debt.